Wyoming Territory, 1879. The first snow clung to the grass like frost on glass, and Willa Langford stood barefoot on her porch watching a wagon disappear down the ridge with her baby inside it. Her knees buckled, but she did not fall. She would not give them the satisfaction. The man who had taken her daughter was named Malcolm Price. He wore a dusty black coat and his voice had been calm while he read out the terms. Debt unpaid, $106 including interest, no livestock left, no property of value. The child is collateral until repayment. She's not a possession, Willa had said, gripping the baby tighter. She is now. And then he took Daisy. That was 2 months ago. Now, Willa sat behind the counter of the dry goods store in the half-dead town of Winfield, her hands raw from hauling sacks of flour, her back bent from work that never ended. She had taken the job because it came with a cot in the back and a roof that mostly held. People came and went, barely seeing her. She did not speak unless spoken to. The world had gotten small. Quiet, just her and the ache of a baby's absence. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the bell above the store door rang. Willa looked up. A man stepped inside, tall and broad with a coat stiff from trail dust and a rifle strapped across his back. He had windburned cheeks and sun-creased eyes. His boots thudded twice on the wooden floor and then he stopped. In his arms, wrapped in a worn brown blanket, was a baby with soft curls and a familiar mouth. Willa's heart slammed so hard it hurt, her voice came out hoarse. "That's she yours?" the cowboy asked, his voice rough but steady. Willa dropped the ledger, rushed from behind the counter, and reached with both hands. The blanket shifted. Daisy blinked up at her, sleepy and alive and whole. "Oh God," Willa whispered, tears pouring without permission. How do you have her?" The cowboy handed the baby over gently, like something breakable. "Name's Weston O'Brien," he said. "I found her in a mining camp near Rawlins. Man was passing her off as his niece. She cried for you at night." Willa sank to her knees, holding Daisy against her chest. The baby tucked her head under Willa's chin, just like she used to. "I thought I'd never see her again," Willa said, choking on it. "They took her for a debt." Weston crouched beside her, his hat in one hand. He said as much before he ran. "I tracked him for 8 days. Found the camp, saw the girl, took her back." "You chased him down?" "I did." Willa looked at him, really looked. There was something steady in his gaze, not pity, something else. Respect, maybe, recognition. "You did not have to do that." "No," Weston agreed, "but I could not leave her. She cried like she belonged to someone." Willa held Daisy tighter. "She does," he nodded. "That is why I brought her back." She stood, legs shaking, and gestured toward the back room. "Please, come sit. You must be starving." Weston hesitated, then followed. Inside, the cot was barely big enough for one person, but the stove was warm and the coffee smelled fresh. Willa poured him a tin cup, then sat with Daisy in her lap and her eyes never far from the man who had brought her baby home. Weston drank quietly. Then he said, "You live here. I work here. The man who owns it gives me the back room. I was not going to leave town. I was not going to let her come back and not find me." He nodded again, like he understood that kind of promise. Willa glanced down at Daisy, who had fallen asleep against her chest. Then back at Weston, who still had not looked away. "You said your name is Weston?" "Yes, ma'am, I am Willa." She hesitated. "I do not know how to thank you." "You do not have to. I did not do it for thanks." "Then why?" He looked away for the first time, jaw working. "Because she reminded me of my sister," he said finally. "She died in childbirth. Baby did not make it. I could not save them, but I could save this one." Willa's throat tightened. "You did." They sat in silence for a while. The stove crackled and the wind howled outside. Then Weston asked, "Do you have family?" "No one left." He nodded slowly. "I do not either." There was something bare in that, an honesty she had not expected from a stranger. Willa reached forward and laid her hand on his just for a moment. "You are not a stranger anymore." Weston's fingers turned under hers just slightly, held on. That night he stayed in the store's front room. Willa gave him an extra blanket and half her dinner. Daisy slept between them on the cot, and Willa kept waking just to touch her cheek, as if to make sure she was real. By dawn, the snow had stopped. The sky was a cold, pale blue. Weston stood outside, saddling his horse. Willa came out with Daisy in her arms. I owe you more than I can say, she said. You do not owe me anything. He looked like he was going to mount up, then paused. I do not have a place I need to be right away, he said slowly. I could stay a while, help around the store if you need it. Willa blinked. Why? Because you and that little girl deserve someone standing on your side, and I would not mind being that someone. She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. All right. He smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him. All right. The first week passed with the rhythm of shared work. Weston rose early, swept the porch, and split wood before the sun cleared the ridgeline. Willa watched him through the shop window, Daisy on her hip, the child's small hand curled around the collar of her blouse. He never asked for pay. When she offered him a few coins from the till one evening, he only shook his head and said, I'm not here for coin. They didn't speak of that night he brought Daisy home, not directly. But something between them had settled quiet, steady, like the sound of a stream under ice. Willa began setting out 2 cups in the morning without thinking. Weston brought back kindling without being asked. One afternoon, the mail coach rolled in with a wheel bent from the last stage. The driver stomped in, cursing the axle, and dropped off a battered envelope addressed to Willa in unfamiliar script. She turned it over twice in her hands before opening it. Inside was a single page, written in the clipped legal tone of someone paid to be heartless. It came from a firm in Cheyenne. The debt had been assumed by a new claimant, someone named Harold Linton, and the balance had grown with interest. They still expected payment. She read it again, slower this time. Her fingers curled around the paper, then released. Trouble? Weston asked. He was restocking cartridges by the counter, sleeves rolled to the elbow. A man I've never met now owns the debt that nearly cost me my child, she said, her voice flat. Weston straightened. Did they say where he is? Cheyenne. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the ledger drawer. They'll come looking again if they think I'm still worth shaking down. He didn't answer at first, then he said, I'll ride out in the morning. Her eyes flicked up. You don't owe me that. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. I know I don't. But it's easier to stand in front of trouble than to wait for it to knock. She carried Daisy to the back room later, laid her down with a warm cloth tucked at her side, and returned to find Weston still near the stove, polishing the barrel of his rifle. His coat hung from a peg. The fire drew copper from his hair as he turned the metal slowly in his hands. You ever been to Cheyenne? She asked. Too many times. It's a cold town in a fine coat, pretty on the outside. Hard underneath. He didn't look at her, but his voice had a weight she hadn't heard before. Something older than the man he looked. Is that where your sister was? He nodded once. She worked in a boarding house, said she liked the noise. Said it made her feel like life hadn't forgotten her. Willa sat across from him, hands folded in her lap. I used to think once I paid off the land, things would settle, that I'd plant a garden, raise Daisy quiet, but it never stops, does it, the owing? He looked at her then. It stops when someone says no. She held his gaze. You think you can say no to Linton? If I can't, I'll find someone who can. In the morning, Willa packed him bread wrapped in cloth, a tin of dried apples, and a small jar of goose grease for his hands. She didn't say goodbye when he rode out, just watched him disappear past the low rise like she had once watched a wagon take her daughter. But this time, she wasn't left hollow. This time, she knew he'd come back 3 days past. On the 4th, as twilight bled into the corners of the sky, Weston returned. His face was drawn, one knuckle split, but he rode upright, and his eyes found hers the moment he crossed the threshold. Willa stepped out from behind the counter. Well, he unwrapped a folded document from his coat. Laid it on the counter. Debt's gone. He signed it over when I made it clear the only thing he'd get from you was a fight. She picked up the paper, read the signature. Her knees gave a little, but she caught herself on the edge of the counter. I don't understand. Why would he? I told him the girl was already taken once. I told him it wouldn't happen again. She looked up, something tight in her chest loosening by degrees. You rode all that way and stood in front of a man with money and lawyers, and he wasn't the first man who tried to take what wasn't his. He didn't elaborate. She didn't press him. That night, she asked him to eat with her in the back room. The cot was still there, but she'd cleared space for a small table she'd bartered from the cooper's widow. 2 plates, 2 forks, Daisy curled in her blanket near the stove. As Weston reached for the bread, his hand brushed hers. She didn't move it. "I don't know how to live without waiting for something to go wrong," she said quietly. "I know," he answered. Then he added, "but we could try something else, something steadier." She looked at him across the fire's glow and thought of the man who had brought her daughter home, who had stood between her and the weight of the world more than once, who never asked for anything in return. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." The spring thaw came slow to Windfield, creeping down from the mountains in rivulets that cut through the hard, packed earth like veins. Willa stood outside the store one morning, Daisy perched on her hip, watching the last of the snow melt into the road. Weston was across the street, pulling nails from an old fence rail, sleeves rolled to the elbow, his shoulder lifting with each strike. She hadn't asked him to fix it. He hadn't asked if he should. By early April, he was sleeping in the loft above the storeroom. It hadn't been discussed. He simply moved his bedroll up there one evening after Daisy had gone to sleep, and Willa had handed him a folded quilt without saying a word. She'd made it herself years ago with scraps from her mother's dresses. One night, long after the town had gone quiet, she heard his boots coming down the stairs. She was sitting at the table, ledger open, trying to make the numbers stretch far enough to cover a new order of sugar and a bolt of muslin for sewing. Weston stopped just inside the room. "You've been staring at that page for near an hour. I'm trying to make $5 into 15. He leaned against the doorframe, not crossing the space between them. "You ever think of selling the store?" She looked up sharply. "It's not mine to sell," he nodded once. "But if it were," she tapped the pencil against the table. "I'd trade it for a patch of land and a well that doesn't freeze in winter." He came closer, pulled out the chair opposite her, and sat. "You ever run cattle?" "No. But I can mend tack, cook for a crew, and hold my own with a branding iron." He rested his forearms on the table. "My uncle left me a claim near the Sweetwater. It's got pasture, a stream, and a barn that needs more than paint. I haven't been back since he passed." She closed the ledger. "It's still yours. For now." Willa didn't speak at first. "Then, you asking me to come with you?" "I'm saying I'd rather build something with you than fix fence posts for a man who's never said thank you." She watched the way his hands stilled on the table, not fidgeting, waiting. "I don't want Daisy growing up with her back to the wall. She won't. And I won't be taken from her, not for a note, not for a man's word. I wouldn't let it happen." Willa reached for the ledger again, but her hands stopped halfway. "If we go, we do it together. Not you leading and me following. We build it even. Do you understand me?" He didn't hesitate. "I do." She leaned forward. "And you don't walk away when the winter's long or the roof leaks or I lose my temper." "I stay." Willa exhaled slowly and stood, crossing to the stove. She poured 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. "We'll need a wagon," she said, "and seed, and a harness that won't snap under weight." He took the cup. "We'll leave after the next freight comes through." 2 weeks later, they packed everything they owned into the back of a worn wagon Willa had traded 3 jars of preserves and a bolt of blue calico for. Daisy rode between them on the bench seat, her hands curled into Weston's sleeve as the road opened wide and full ahead of them. They passed out of Windfield with the morning sun at their backs and the scent of new grass in the wind. Willa didn't look over her shoulder. There was nothing left behind her worth seeing. That night they made camp near a bend in the creek, the wagon pulled into a copse of cottonwoods. Weston built the fire while Willa laid Daisy down on a bed of quilts beneath the wagon. When the child had fallen asleep, Willa sat beside him, knees drawn up, warmth from the fire brushing her face. He passed her a tin plate with beans and salt pork. She took it, their fingers brushing. "I used to think contentment was a lie folks told themselves when they stopped dreaming," she said. And now, she looked at the firelight on his face, the lines of his mouth drawn soft by peace, and the steady sound of her daughter breathing. "Now I think it's something you build. Brick by brick, hand by hand." He reached for her hand, calloused fingers sliding over hers. "Then let's build." She didn't answer with words, just leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. The land Weston had spoken of lay north of the Sweetwater River, tucked into a shallow valley where the grass grew in thick knots and the hills shielded the worst of the wind. The barn leaned westward, its beams bowed like tired shoulders, but the roof held. The house was one room, squat and sun-faded, with a stone hearth and a door that stuck after rain. Still, Willa stepped into the place with Daisy on her hip and no trace of doubt in her eyes. They spent the first week clearing what the snow had left behind fallen limbs, a shattered window pane, a rusted plow half buried near the fence line. Weston hauled water from the spring while Willa scrubbed the stone floor until her knuckles bled. They slept on pallets beside the hearth, Daisy tucked between wool blankets, the child's breath soft and even in the silence. One morning, Willa knelt by the fence post, pressing her shoulder into the shovel, when Weston came from the far side of the lot carrying a bundle of cedar planks. "You don't have to do that today," he said, setting the wood down. "I know," she pressed the shovel deeper, "but this corner's been leaning since we got here." He took the post-hole digger from where it leaned against the rails and stepped beside her. "You always work like you're fighting something," he said. She didn't answer right away. "Then, I used to think if I kept moving, the grief wouldn't catch up." He adjusted the brim of his hat. "And now I think it's not something you outrun. Just something you carry until it shifts shape." Weston worked beside her in silence. When they lifted the new post into the hole, she rested her hand on the top of it, palm flat. "I've never planted anything that grew," she said. "Not really. Not where it lasted." He reached for the wire and the hammer. "Then we'll make this last." That night, she sat by the hearth sewing a curtain from a flour sack while Weston read a dog-eared almanac by lantern. Daisy slept with her thumb in her mouth, her curls damp from a warm cloth bath. Willa looked up. "You missed the trail." He turned the page. "Sometimes there's a kind of honesty in the dust." But he folded the book shut. "But I've never unpacked my saddle this long before, and I haven't once thought about leaving." She set the needle down. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong." He looked at her. "I don't think peace means nothing ever does. I think it means when it does, you don't face it alone." Willa stood and crossed to the window. The moon hung low, silver over the pasture. She pulled the curtain closed. "I've never had anyone stay." Weston set the almanac aside and stood. "I never had a reason to." She turned then, but didn't move toward him. The fire popped behind her, casting her face in shifting light. "I don't know how to be soft with someone." "You don't have to be." He stepped closer. "You just have to be honest." Her voice barely carried. "I want this, you, Daisy, this quiet life." His hand touched hers, fingers warm and sure. "Then it's ours." She looked down at their joined hands, then up at him. "I want more than surviving." "I do too." Outside, the wind moved through the grass. Inside, she leaned into him, her head against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her like it was the most natural thing in the world. They stood that way until the fire burned low, and then, without ceremony, without any need for words, they turned toward the room they now shared. A space that smelled of cedar and ash and something beginning. In the weeks that followed, they planted potatoes and barley. Weston built a second pen for milk goats, and Willa stitched a quilt from worn cotton scraps to cover the new bed Weston had carved from pine. Daisy learned to toddle through the rows with dirt under her nails and laughter in her throat. One evening, Willa sat on the porch steps, watching the last light fade behind the ridge. Weston came from the barn, hands streaked with oil, and sat beside her. She rested her head against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd have a home again," she said. "You do now." His arm came around her, steady as the ground beneath them, and for once the quiet held no threat, only the promise of tomorrow. May came with yellow blooms along the creek bank and long days that left the skin warm even after sundown. Willa stood in the doorway of the cabin, brushing flour from her hands as Weston came up from the lower pasture, his shirt damp at the collar and his hat slung low against the sun. Daisy chased grasshoppers in the yard, her hair wild with wind and freedom. Weston stepped onto the porch and set down the sack slung over his shoulder. "Fence held through the storm last night. No washouts," Willa nodded. "The dough's risen. Bread'll be ready before dark." He leaned against the post. You ever think you'd be baking bread for someone again? She wiped her palms on her apron. Not like this. Not with someone who comes home covered in dust instead of liquor. Weston's mouth twitched, not with humor but with something gentler. This life, do you miss the town? I miss having a dry roof that didn't leak above the bed. She stepped out beside him. But I'd take this roof with you under it over anything Windfield had. He looked out over the pasture. I was thinking of building a smokehouse. And maybe a second room before the ground freezes again. I was thinking of painting the shutters, she replied. Something like green, not because it needs it, just because it'd be pretty. He glanced at her and his voice softened. You still think about leaving? No, she said, after a pause that wasn't hesitation. But sometimes I catch myself listening for a wagon I don't want to see or a knock I don't want to answer. Weston shifted closer, his shoulder brushing hers. That part might never go away. But you don't have to brace for it alone. They stood in the shade until Daisy ran up with a squashed buttercup in her fist, demanding Willa's attention. Willa knelt, took the flower, and tucked it behind her ear with a smile that reached deeper than it used to. Later, after supper, Weston sat with a whetstone and his pocketknife while Willa hemmed a dress for Daisy. The fire cast long shadows on the walls, and the air smelled faintly of yeast and smoke. You ever think about marriage? Willa asked, not looking up from her stitching. Weston's hand paused mid-stroke. I did once, a long time ago. What stopped it? She didn't want the trail, and I didn't know how to stop walking it. Willa set the dress in her lap. You've stopped now? I have. He looked at her then. Do you ever think about it? She nodded once. I do. More now than I ever let myself. He set the knife down. Would you want that again, after everything? She met his eyes. Not again. For the first time the way it should have been. Weston stood, crossed the floor, and knelt beside her chair. Then say the word. She reached for his face, thumb brushing the scar near his temple. Yes. He took her hand and kissed the inside of her wrist. The wedding was held on the ridge above the pasture 2 Sundays later. The circuit preacher came through on his way to Fort Washakie, and Willa wore a dress she'd dyed with indigo and walnut husk. Daisy carried a small basket of creek blossoms, and Weston stood beside Willa like the earth had anchored him there. The preacher's words were simple, spoken without flourish. When he asked if they would forge their lives together, Willa answered first strong and steady. Afterward, they ate bread and smoked trout under the cottonwoods, and Daisy fell asleep with her head in Weston's lap, her fingers curled around a pine cone. That night, the wind rose through the grass, and the fire burned low in the hearth. Willa sat on the floor beside the bed, brushing out her hair. Weston came behind her, kneeling to gather the strands into his hands. I never thought I'd belong somewhere, he said. She leaned back into him. You belong here with us. He kissed her shoulder, slow and certain. They lay down together, the room quiet but for the sound of the wind threading through the shutters and the soft breath of their daughter in the corner. In the mornings, Willa rose first, lit the stove, and set bread to rise. Weston saddled the mule and checked the fences. They spoke little before coffee, but everything that needed saying passed between them in glances and gestures, his hand at the small of her back, her palm resting for a second longer on his arm. Daisy grew taller, her feet sure on the dirt path to the creek. She learned to gather eggs, to call the goats by name, and to sit still long enough for Willa to braid her hair. The shutters were painted green before the first frost. They chipped some by spring, but neither Willa nor Weston minded. Peace didn't come all at once. It settled in gradual like light through heavy cloud until one day Willa realized she hadn't listened for trouble in weeks, and when Weston came through the door, dust in his hair and a beam of sunlight behind his shoulders, she didn't brace. She smiled. He came to her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and kissed her as if he'd been waiting all day to come home, because he had. Because home was her, always had been, always would be.